I
My mother
realized that the
slammed a
most
piece of
important
paper
thing
onto the
was to be
dining
true to
table and
myself,
demanded
even when it was
$80,000 in
scary.
back rent.
And that's the story I
She
want to share
crossed
with
her
you
arms
today.
and warned that my first 2,000 was due by Sunday, or she would take the keys to my car and sell it. My father stood right beside her, nodding in agreement, adding that from now on, they were adding 10% interest every month, just like a real landlord. My sister laughed from the sofa, and my aunt called me a worthless bum who had overstayed her welcome. I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply left that night. I had no idea that within a single week they would be weeping outside my building begging me to take them back. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who pushed you too far. My name is Cassidy. I am 33 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant. I had spent my entire life trying to earn my family's love, but that invoice severed the final string of my patience. The paper my mother, Patricia, threw at me was a handmade invoice scribbled with ridiculous calculations and aggressive late fees. We were standing in the formal dining room of the house I grew up in. I was still wearing my black morning dress, my feet aching terribly from standing at the cemetery all morning. We had just buried my grandfather 4 hours earlier. I had moved back into my childhood bedroom exactly 3 months ago, not because I needed a free place to stay, but because my grandfather was dying of advanced stomach cancer. My parents had flatly refused to pay for a professional hospice nurse, loudly claiming it was a massive waste of their country club membership funds. So I packed up my life, moved in, and provided round-the-clock end-of-life care for him myself. I bathed him, administered his daily morphine doses, and held his frail hand while he took his last painful breath. Now, with his grave barely covered in fresh dirt, my parents decided it was time to collect their imaginary debt. My mother tapped her manicured fingernail against the $80,000 total printed at the bottom of the page. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust, her eyes filled with cold calculation. "You have been eating our expensive food, using our electricity, and taking up valuable space in our house for 3 months," she declared, her voice echoing harshly in the large room. "Plus, we never charged you rent when you lived here during your community college years." We sat down and did the math. "You owe us for all of it down to the last cent." My father, Richard, stood tall next to her, confidently adjusting the collar of his expensive golf shirt. "You need to learn how the real world works, Cassidy," he said with a condescending sneer that made my stomach turn. "Nothing in this life is free. From now on, we are adding 10% interest every month, just like a real landlord. You have until Sunday to give us $2,000 in cash, or I am taking the title to your Audi. We have been generous long enough." They were deliberately weaponizing my fresh grief, using the exact day of my grandfather's funeral to ambush me when they assumed I would be too emotionally broken and exhausted to fight back. From the living room sofa, my younger sister Melody giggled loudly. She was 29, the undeniable golden child of the family, lounging comfortably next to her husband DeAndre. DeAndre was a 32-year-old African-American self-proclaimed cryptocurrency investor who loved flashing his supposed wealth on social media. He leaned back against the cushions, spinning a set of shiny car keys on his index finger, and flashed a deeply mocking grin in my direction. "Hey, sister-in-law!" DeAndre called out, his tone dripping with heavy sarcasm and unearned arrogance. "Melody and I just bought our second Tesla yesterday. We are doing incredibly well, closing massive deals every single week. If you are too broke to make your car payments, just say the word. I might let you wash my expensive rims for a few bucks so you can pay your new landlords." I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice to remind them that I had sacrificed my own peace and career trajectory to care for a dying man they purposely ignored. My intense job as a forensic accountant had trained me to look strictly at cold hard facts, and the undeniable fact was these people were no longer my family. They were parasites trying to extract whatever they could. I reached into my leather purse, pulled out the heavy brass house key they had given me 3 months ago, and dropped it directly onto their ridiculous invoice. I packed my bag and left. "Where do you think you are going?" Patricia screamed, her voice hitting a frantic, panicked pitch as my hand firmly grasped the front doorknob. "You cannot just walk away from your debts. If you do not have $2,000 in my hand by Sunday morning, I swear I will call the police and report your car stolen. I opened the heavy oak door, stepped out into the freezing winter night, and let the door click firmly shut behind me, leaving her empty threats and their toxic demands trapped securely inside. I started the engine shifting into gear without glancing at the living room window. I knew they were watching, expecting me to break down and beg for mercy. Instead, I drove away, my mind already calculating my next legal move. They wanted to play landlord, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. I drove through the icy downtown streets, my dashboard glowing in the dark cabin. I pulled into a hotel parking garage, needing a sanctuary to process the absurdity of my parents' demands. After swiping my credit card for a standard room, I carried my single duffel bag upstairs. The room was quiet, devoid of the toxic, heavy atmosphere that suffocated my childhood home. I took a scalding hot shower to wash off the scent of funeral lilies and the lingering stench of my family's greed. Exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. I had barely slept during my grandfather's final weeks, staying awake to monitor his oxygen levels, while my parents attended wine tasting mixers. I crawled into the crisp white hotel sheets, setting my phone on the nightstand, desperate for a few hours of uninterrupted rest. The darkness offered fragile peace. That peace shattered exactly at 3 in the morning. A harsh, blaring alarm erupted from my nightstand. It was not my standard wake-up call. It was the distinct, piercing notification tone I assigned strictly to my financial security applications. My eyes snapped open, my forensic accountant instincts instantly overriding my physical exhaustion. I grabbed my phone, the bright screen searing my tired eyes. A push notification from my primary banking app demanded my immediate attention. A massive withdrawal had just been executed. My heart slammed against my ribs as I unlocked the screen to inspect the transaction details. This was not a fraudulent credit card charge from a random hacker halfway across the globe. This was a direct targeted wire transfer pulled straight from a specific savings account, and the authorized user listed on the receipt made my blood run absolutely cold. I stared at the digital receipt in utter disbelief. $5,000, my entire liquid emergency fund, had vanished in a single keystroke. I quickly traced the routing numbers. The transfer originated from an old student checking account I had opened when I was 16 years old. Because I was a minor at the time, my mother, Patricia, was legally required to be listed as a joint account holder. Over the past decade and a half, I had completely forgotten her name was still attached to that specific routing number. I used that account strictly as a secure vault for fast, accessible cash, assuming the digital barriers I built were enough to keep it safe. I underestimated my mother's desperation and her absolute lack of moral boundaries. Patricia and Richard had not just threatened me at the dinner table. They had logged into the banking portal the very second I drove away, exploiting that ancient legal loophole to systematically drain my emergency safety net. They bypassed my password protections simply by verifying my mother's social security number with the bank's automated phone system. It was a calculated predatory strike designed to cripple me financially before I could even formulate a defense. Before I could even call the fraud department, my screen lit up with an incoming text message. It was from Patricia. I did not need to guess her motives because she proudly spelled them out for me. Consider this a down payment on what you owe us. The message read, radiating arrogance through the digital text. We secured the $5,000. You still owe us another $1,500 by Sunday to cover your first installment. Do not test me, Cassidy. I will report you to the authorities if you try to reverse this transfer. We are your landlords and we are collecting our rightful property. I sat frozen on the edge of the hotel bed. The sheer audacity of her message was staggering. She had literally stolen $5,000 from her grieving daughter in the dead of night and had the nerve to demand more. They thought they had trapped me. They believed this financial blow would force me to crawl back to their doorstep begging for forgiveness and a place to sleep. They thought taking my cash would break my spirit. Instead, it only solidified my resolve. I took a screenshot of her text message and saved it directly to an encrypted cloud folder. Patricia had just handed me a written time-stamped confession of financial exploitation. I was already drafting an email to my banking representative when a second, completely different alarm went off. This time it was a high-pitched chime coming from the proprietary security application linked to my Audi. I switched tabs, my adrenaline spiking. The app displayed a glowing red icon indicating that my vehicle's engine had just been engaged. The GPS tracker showed the car moving, pulling slowly out of the hotel's underground parking garage. My mind raced. I had both physical key fobs sitting right next to me on the hotel nightstand. There was only one logical explanation. DeAndre, my arrogant brother-in-law, had bragged about his connections in the luxury car scene. He must have used a signal cloning device to duplicate my fob's frequency while I was packing my bags at the house. He had tracked my location using a hidden tracking tag, or the family sharing app my sister Melody insisted we install years ago. They were not just satisfied with draining my bank account. They were executing Patricia's threat to seize my vehicle. DeAndre was driving my car into the night, likely heading straight to one of his shady underground contacts to pawn it for quick cash or strip it for parts to fund his failing crypto schemes. They thought I was a helpless victim sleeping soundly in a hotel room while they systematically stripped away my assets. I watched the little digital car icon turn onto the main avenue, heading toward the industrial district. I did not panic. I did not rush downstairs to chase him. I simply smiled in the dark room, opened the master control panel on my app, and prepared to teach my brother-in-law a very harsh lesson about modern automotive security. I did not dial 911. Calling the authorities while the car was quietly cruising down a deserted suburban side street would give DeAndre a chance to slip away into the shadows and abandon the vehicle without facing any real consequences. I wanted him to feel the exact same public exposure and utter helplessness my family had tried to force upon me at that dining table. Sitting cross-legged on the hotel bed, I kept my eyes locked on the glowing digital map. The small green icon, representing my Audi, accelerated as it approached the city center. DeAndre was heading straight for the bustling downtown district, likely trying to show off his newly acquired prize to his shady associates outside the high-end nightclubs before taking it to a chop shop or pawning it off. I watched his speed fluctuate on my screen. He was driving recklessly heavy on the accelerator, enjoying the smooth power of the expensive engine I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks to afford. I poured a glass of bottled water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and waited with the cold patience of a predator. I needed the absolute perfect location to spring the trap. The digital blip turned onto Grand Avenue, the busiest thoroughfare in the entire city, packed with late-night taxis, rideshares, and throngs of pedestrians leaving the bars. He approached the massive six-lane intersection at 5th Street. The traffic light indicator on my digital grid showed he was merging directly into the center lane. This was the moment. I opened the master security interface on my application. A bright red warning flashed across my phone screen, asking me to confirm the emergency immobilization protocol. I did not hesitate for a single second. I tapped my thumb firmly against the confirmation button. A secondary command sequence deployed silently through the cellular network, transmitting directly into the Audi onboard computer system. I watched the live diagnostic feed as the fuel injectors were remotely cut off. The transmission locked securely into park as the vehicle safety protocols engaged. DeAndre was suddenly sitting inside a 2-ton completely paralyzed metal brick in the dead center of the most heavily trafficked intersection in the entire city. My digital counterattack was flawless and brutally effective. Through the integrated security dashcam feature on my app, I activated the live audio and video feed. The interior camera flickered to life, showing DeAndre frantically slamming his hands against the leather steering wheel. His arrogant, untouchable cryptocurrency investor persona evaporated instantly. He mashed the push to start button over and over, but the dashboard remained completely dark, displaying only a stark anti-theft lockout warning in bright red letters. Outside the vehicle, the city erupted in absolute chaos. A chorus of angry car horns blared as traffic rapidly piled up behind the immobilized Audi, creating a massive gridlock that stretched for blocks. Angry drivers leaned out of their windows, yelling at him to move the vehicle out of the intersection. DeAndre tried to open the driver's side door to escape the mounting embarrassment, but my remote lockdown had permanently engaged the heavy deadbolts. I was trapped inside a glass and steel fishbowl of his own making, fully exposed to the glaring headlights and the irritated stares of dozens of pedestrians who were already pulling out their smartphones to record the pathetic spectacle. He looked terrified, his eyes darting around wildly as he pulled out his cell phone, likely dialing my sister Melody or my mother to beg for an immediate rescue. Right as the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser reflected off the Audi windshield, I minimized the camera feed and pulled up the keypad on my phone. I dialed the non-emergency police dispatch line. A calm operator answered, and I kept my voice perfectly composed and professional. "I need to report a stolen vehicle," I stated, providing my license plate number and vehicle identification details. "My security application shows the car is currently disabled and blocking traffic at the intersection of 5th and Grand. The unauthorized driver is still trapped inside the vehicle." The operator confirmed that officers were already approaching the car to assist with what they thought was a simple breakdown. I could hear the exact moment the police radios synced up with my theft report. Through the live audio feed on my app, I listened as the officers tapped sharply on the driver's side window, ordering DeAndre to unlock the doors and step out of the vehicle with his hands clearly visible. His panicked, high-pitched voice echoed through the microphone as he tried to explain that he had permission to drive the car. A desperate lie that completely fell apart when the officers ran the registration and confirmed my stolen vehicle report. DeAndre was forcibly extracted from the vehicle and immediately placed in handcuffs right in the middle of the crowded intersection. Dozens of late-night onlookers filmed the entire humiliating ordeal as the self-proclaimed wealthy investor was patted down, publicly searched, and shoved roughly into the back of a police cruiser. He was detained at the downtown precinct for hours, sweating in a holding cell and begging for a phone call. He only avoided a felony grand theft auto charge because Patricia rushed to the police station in the middle of the night. She shamelessly lied to the investigating officers, spinning a frantic, tearful story about a simple family misunderstanding over borrowed car keys. Because of my mother's desperate perjury and manipulation, the police eventually released DeAndre with a severe warning. However, they did not release my vehicle to him. Following standard municipal procedure for a reported theft involving a remote immobilization lock, the police ordered a heavy-duty tow truck to drag the Audi away. My car was securely locked inside a heavily guarded city impound lot, completely out of my family's greedy reach. I turned off my phone screen, set it on the nightstand, and finally laid my head back against the crisp hotel pillows, enjoying the sweetest, most restful sleep I had experienced in months. I woke up late the next morning, the winter sun filtering through the hotel curtains. My physical exhaustion was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp mental clarity. I reached for my phone, expecting a barrage of angry texts. Instead, I found my inbox flooded with notifications from a different source entirely: social media. Patricia had not wasted a single second. Furious over DeAndre being humiliated and handcuffed in the middle of a busy intersection, my mother decided to weaponize her favorite tool, her carefully curated public image. She had logged onto Facebook and unleashed a massive multi-paragraph smear campaign designed to destroy my reputation. I opened her public post and read the absolute fiction she had spun for her country club friends and our extended relatives. In her twisted narrative, I was a monster. Patricia claimed that I had violently abandoned her and my father in their hour of need, completely omitting the fact that I had just spent a grueling 3 months providing unpaid hospice care for my grandfather. She accused me of severe elder financial abuse, stating that I was hoarding wealth while refusing to contribute to the household expenses that were slowly driving them into poverty. She painted DeAndre as a selfless hero who had simply tried to move my car to wash it as a favor, only for me to maliciously report it stolen to ruin his bright, successful crypto business reputation. The crowning jewel of her delusion was a link attached at the very bottom of the post. Patricia had created a GoFundMe page titled "Help Save Two Loving Parents from Their Greedy Daughter." She set the fundraising goal at exactly $80,000, the precise amount she had tried to extort from me the night before. In the campaign description, she begged her friends and neighbors for donations, claiming that my ruthless financial abandonment was going to cause them to lose their beloved family home. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. She was actively crowdsourcing the ransom money she failed to steal from me directly. The post already had hundreds of likes, shares, and a sickeningly long comment thread filled with people sending their prayers and expressing absolute disgust at my behavior. They were buying her lies completely. The digital mob did not stop at Facebook comments. My mother had successfully deployed her flying monkeys. My phone began vibrating continuously with a fresh wave of toxic voicemails from our extended family. The most vicious messages came from my Aunt Brenda, the neighborhood gossip who lived for this kind of drama. I listened to the first voicemail as I packed my duffel bag. Aunt Brenda was practically screaming into the microphone. "How dare you treat your mother this way?" she shrieked, her voice dripping with venom. "After everything Patricia has done for you, you set up your own brother-in-law to be arrested like a common criminal. You are a sociopath, Cassidy. You need to march back to that house right now, drop to your knees and apologize to DeAndre. And you better hand over that $80,000 you owe your parents before God strikes you down for your wicked greed." There were nearly a dozen similar messages from cousins and distant relatives, all blindly echoing Patricia's victim narrative. They demanded I empty my accounts to save my struggling parents. They called me a miserable freeloader, a massive disappointment, and an absolute disgrace to our prestigious family name. They thought this barrage of manufactured outrage and emotional blackmail would crush me into submission. They assumed I was sitting in my cheap hotel room crying over my shattered reputation, desperately trying to figure out how to grovel for their forgiveness. I absolutely did not shed a single tear over any of their pathetic insults. I did not block their numbers or delete the hateful voicemails. Instead, I carefully exported every single audio file and saved them directly into my encrypted forensic evidence folder. They were handing me the exact ammunition I needed for the upcoming war. I ignored every text, every missed call, and every Facebook notification. I zipped my duffel bag, checked out of the hotel, and stepped out onto the icy pavement. I did not hail a ride back to the suburbs to defend myself, and I certainly did not head toward the impound lot to retrieve my car just yet. I waved down a yellow cab and gave the driver an address located in the most exclusive high-security financial district in the heart of downtown. 20 minutes later, the cab pulled up to a soaring modern glass skyscraper. I walked through the revolving doors, nodding to the uniformed concierge, who immediately recognized me and buzzed me through the private resident-only elevators. I pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator doors slid open directly into my actual home, a sprawling, ultra-luxurious penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city skyline. This was my sanctuary. I owned this multi-million-dollar property outright purchased entirely with the wealth I had built through years of grueling high-stakes forensic accounting work. It was a massive, tangible symbol of my true financial power, a reality I had kept completely secret from my parasitic parents, my entitled sister, and her scam artist husband. I knew that if they ever discovered my actual net worth, their demands for money would have escalated from petty theft to absolute extortion long ago. I dropped my duffel bag onto the imported Italian marble floor and walked over to my massive oak desk overlooking the city. I was no longer playing defense. My family wanted to steal my money, steal my car, and destroy my name for $80,000. It was finally time for me to show them exactly what a real, legally devastating financial execution looked like, and I would absolutely make sure that they all remembered the exact cost of their profound betrayal forever. I slowly powered up my heavy workstation. The curved monitors hummed to life, casting a stark white glow across the dark oak desk. This was my war room. For years I had utilized these very screens to dismantle corporate embezzlement rings and trace illicit offshore funds for federal clients. Now I was aiming that same devastating analytical power directly at my own blood. I pulled up the digital screenshot of the handwritten invoice Patricia had thrown at me, $80,000. In the world of financial forensics, a perfectly round number demanded under intense duress is never a coincidence. It is a specific quota needed to plug a catastrophic leak before a dam bursts completely. I logged into my secure database and began cross-referencing the routing numbers connected to the high school checking account Patricia had drained earlier that morning. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, executing deep background searches and pulling property tax records. Why did they need exactly $80,000 by this specific Sunday? My parents had spent the last decade aggressively projecting the image of wealthy country club elites. They drove luxury leased vehicles, wore designer brands, and bragged constantly about their lavish vacations. But numbers do not care about country club reputations. Numbers only tell the cold, unfiltered truth. I initiated a comprehensive asset trace directly linking their names, previous addresses, and known business entities to local municipal court databases and federal lending registries. The search algorithms were compiling massive amounts of data in real time. I watched the progress bar inch forward, knowing that beneath their arrogant facade of wealth, Patricia and Richard were hiding a terminal financial illness. My mother had confidently demanded that I pay my so-called back rent to save her home, but my initial sweeps were already showing severe anomalies in their property ownership status. I opened a fresh digital dossier, ready to dissect every single transaction, every hidden loan, and every desperate financial maneuver they had executed over the past 5 years. I was going to follow the money, and I knew exactly how to find where every single stolen cent was buried. The glowing screens reflected in the dark glass windows of my penthouse. Every keystroke felt like a deliberate strike against the fake reality my family had constructed. I was done being the silent victim of their constant psychological abuse, deceit, and endless manipulation. The first batch of public records finished compiling, and the results were absolutely staggering. I pulled up their credit profiles and property deeds, my eyes scanning rows of red flags and catastrophic financial decisions. Patricia and Richard were not just struggling, they were standing on the edge of total economic annihilation. I traced the routing number from my stolen $5,000 to their primary checking account, then followed the outgoing digital trails. The web of debt was terrifyingly vast. They had taken out a second mortgage on the house years ago, draining the equity to maintain their fake country club lifestyle. When that cash dried up, they opened multiple high-interest personal loans. I found 14 different credit lines, all completely maxed out to their absolute limits. The transaction histories showed a pattern of desperate, frantic survival. They were utilizing cash advances from one credit card simply to make the minimum monthly payments on another. This is what we call a financial death spiral. It is a mathematical certainty of ruin. I dug deeper into the municipal property records, uncovering multiple missed property tax payments and final warning notices from aggressive collection agencies. My father, who had stood in the dining room lecturing me about how the real world works, had defaulted on 3 separate business loans in the past 18 months alone. Their pristine suburban image was entirely built on a foundation of decaying debt. But the most glaring anomaly was the timeline. The aggressive default notices and the sudden panicked cash grabs had all accelerated dramatically within the last 90 days. The $80,000 Patricia demanded was not just a random extortion attempt. I found a massive balloon payment scheduled to hit their primary accounts by next Monday morning. If they defaulted on this specific payment, their entire house of cards would instantly collapse, triggering cross defaults on their remaining loans. They were cornered. They needed cash immediately, and they had decided I was going to be their sacrificial lamb. Yet as I traced the flow of funds outward from their drained accounts, a disturbing pattern emerged. The borrowed money and the cash advances were not being used to pay down the principal on their mortgages or stabilize their debts. They were actively hemorrhaging cash elsewhere in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. This volume of outgoing transfers made absolutely no logical sense for a couple facing foreclosure. I immediately ran a sophisticated tracking algorithm on the outgoing wire transfers, breaking through layers of basic obfuscation. The money was not staying in any domestic banking institutions at all. Patricia and Richard were systematically funneling hundreds of thousands of borrowed dollars directly into unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. I then isolated the primary receiving wallet addresses and cross-referenced the ownership data. The accounts did not belong to my parents. The digital wallets were registered entirely under shell companies controlled by DeAndre. My parents were not hoarding cash to save their home. They were knowingly pouring every single dollar of their fraudulent loans and stolen money directly into my arrogant brother-in-law's shady, untraceable crypto investments. The $80,000 they brutally demanded from me was never meant to pay for my supposed back rent. It was destined to be swallowed completely by DeAndre's massive, crumbling Ponzi scheme. They were willingly sacrificing my financial future, my career, and my sanity to fund his fraudulent lifestyle. Every insult they hurled at me was just a desperate cover for their own criminal complicity. They thought they could rob me blind to keep his illusion alive. They were entirely and absolutely wrong. My gaze remained locked on the sprawling web of offshore transactions displayed on my primary monitor. A cold, sinking realization settled deep in my stomach, freezing my blood. If my parents were this deeply embedded in DeAndre's financial black hole, how far had the contagion spread? In the world of high-stakes forensic accounting, you never assume the financial corruption is neatly contained. You assume it has infected absolutely everything it touched. I opened a highly secure, encrypted portal connected directly to the major national credit bureaus. I rarely pulled my own full credit file, relying instead on automated fraud alerts for my primary banking accounts. But this unprecedented situation demanded a complete, unrestricted audit of my entire personal financial identity. I entered my social security number, answered the complex multi-factor authentication prompts, and requested a deep-level comprehensive credit report. The system took a few agonizing seconds to generate the massive digital file. When the document finally populated on my ultra-wide screen, my breath caught in my throat. My pristine, meticulously maintained 800-plus credit score had completely plummeted, dropping into a catastrophic risk tier. I scrolled rapidly through the first few pages, my eyes scanning the dense rows of alphanumeric financial data. There, buried under my legitimate mortgage and established student loan history, were three massive, glaring anomalies. Someone had successfully opened three separate platinum-tier credit cards in my name. These were not low-limit retail store cards. They were elite high-capacity lending accounts that required excellent credit history and substantial income verification for approval. The total outstanding balance across all three fraudulent accounts was exactly $80,000. Every single card was completely maxed out to its absolute rigid limit. I examined the origination dates with forensic precision. The very first card had been opened exactly 14 months ago, aligning perfectly with the exact month Melody and DeAndre had proudly announced their reckless decision to quit their stable corporate jobs and become full-time cryptocurrency investors. The identity thief had perfectly utilized my social security number, my date of birth, and my spotless financial reputation to bypass the strict banking underwriting algorithms. I immediately initiated a sophisticated reverse digital trace on the original applications associated with those three platinum cards. I needed to see exactly who had forged my electronic signature. I ran the IP addresses used to submit the fraudulent banking applications. They originated directly from a luxury high-rise apartment complex downtown. It was the exact same exclusive building where my sister Melody and her arrogant husband DeAndre currently lived. The billing addresses on the credit accounts had been cleverly routed to a private mail drop box in a neighboring zip code, ensuring I would never receive a physical paper statement in the mail. The email address tied to the online banking portals was a generic burner account, but the secondary recovery phone number matched Melody's personal cell phone digits perfectly. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, forming a horrifying, undeniable picture of ultimate betrayal. Melody and DeAndre had not just stumbled into sudden wealth. They were living lavishly, dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, and portraying themselves as highly successful entrepreneurs entirely on my stolen credit. They had weaponized my identity to fund their luxurious lifestyle and prop up DeAndre's rapidly failing offshore crypto investments. But the most sickening, soul-crushing revelation came when I audited the payment histories on those fraudulent cards. For the first 12 months, the minimum monthly payments had been made consistently, keeping the accounts in good standing and hiding them from collection agencies. I traced the source routing numbers of those minimum payments. The funds came directly from Patricia and Richard's joint checking account. My parents knew. They had known everything from the very beginning. They knew. They actively participated in the criminal cover-up, draining their own legitimate home equity and taking out high-interest personal loans just to make the minimum payments on the credit cards Melody and DeAndre had fraudulently opened in my name. They chose to protect the golden child and her criminal husband by sacrificing my identity, my credit, and my financial future. They chose them. They always chose them. The pain was sharp, deep, and unrelenting. The mathematical reality of their desperate extortion attempt was now terrifyingly brutally clear. The $80,000 my parents had aggressively demanded from me at the dinner table was never intended for back rent. It was not a desperate plea to save their childhood home from a missed mortgage payment. It was a calculated, vicious extortion attempt designed to pay off the massive principal balance on those 3 fraudulent credit cards before they went into severe, irreversible default. I checked the banking terms. The cards were scheduled to officially default next Monday morning. Once those accounts entered default status, the credit bureaus would automatically flag them for immediate investigation, triggering a mandatory federal banking fraud probe that would instantly expose DeAndre and Melody for felony identity theft and federal wire fraud. My parents were literally trying to force me to pay off my own stolen debt with my own legitimate cash simply to save my sister from going to federal prison. They were entirely willing to bankrupt me and destroy my life to keep their dark criminal secret buried forever. A lesser person would have immediately reached for their cell phone. A normal sister would have called Melody screaming, demanding an explanation, or driven straight back to that suffocating suburban house to confront our parents with the undeniable proof of their betrayal. I did none of those things. Confrontation requires emotion, and emotion is a massive liability in a forensic war. Instead, I leaned back in my heavy leather office chair, my pulse remarkably steady. The initial wave of soul-crushing heartbreak had entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute resolve. I was going to dismantle their entire existence brick by digital brick. I opened a fresh encrypted master directory on my workstation and began compiling the evidence. I did not just save the credit reports. I extracted the raw underlying data packets, isolating the exact IP addresses used during the fraudulent online applications. I downloaded the server logs that permanently tied Melody's luxury high-rise apartment to the digital signatures forged in my name. I meticulously cross-referenced every single minimum payment my parents had made to those fraudulent accounts, exporting the official banking ledgers that proved their direct knowing complicity in the ongoing identity theft. I connected to my high-speed laser printer and began turning the digital ghosts into undeniable physical weapons. The machine hummed steadily, churning out page after page of damning financial records, offshore wire transfer receipts, and the time-stamped screenshots of Patricia's extortion texts. I took an empty, heavy-duty black binder from my supply cabinet and began snapping the pages into place. I organized the evidence with the exact same ruthless precision I utilized when preparing expert testimony for federal court. I created specific color-coded tabs. The red tab contained the forged platinum card applications. The yellow tab held DeAndre's offshore cryptocurrency routing numbers. The blue tab documented my parents' desperate joint account payments. Section by section, I built an airtight, unassailable timeline of their criminal conspiracy. This was not a family dispute anymore. This was a fully documented, highly structured prosecution package, and I was the lead investigator, the star witness, and the executioner, all rolled into one. With the physical evidence secured in the massive black binder, I turned my attention to the actual deployment of my counterstrike. I did not need a lawyer to tell me how to destroy DeAndre. As a senior forensic accountant, I knew exactly which federal levers to pull to ensure maximum irreversible devastation. I opened my secure browser and navigated directly to the official portals for federal financial crimes. First, I drafted a comprehensive, highly detailed whistleblower submission for the Internal Revenue Service, utilizing Form 211. I laid out DeAndre's complex web of offshore cryptocurrency wallets, cross-referencing them with his known lack of reported domestic income. I clearly outlined a textbook case of severe tax evasion and money laundering, providing the exact blockchain wallet addresses and transaction hashes. The federal auditors would need to freeze his assets instantly. Next, I moved to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Cybercrime Division, accessing the Internet, Crime Complaint Center. I filed a massive formal report detailing the synthetic identity theft and wire fraud Melody and DeAndre had committed. I did not just submit a generic complaint. I provided the FBI with a ready-made, fully investigated case file. I included the forged digital signatures, the unauthorized credit pulls, and the systemic exploitation of my social security number. I made absolutely sure to specifically name Patricia and Richard as active knowing co-conspirators who had provided the material financial support necessary to keep the fraudulent credit lines open and evade collection agencies. I was handing the federal authorities a slam-dunk felony conviction on a silver platter. Once these reports were processed, there would be no civil settlements, no family apologies, and no turning back. DeAndre would be facing decades in federal prison, and my parents would lose absolutely everything they had illegally tried to protect. I reviewed the final PDF documents, ensuring every single date amount and routing number was perfectly aligned. I clicked submit on both federal portals, simultaneously watching the confirmation screens appear with a profound, icy satisfaction. The trap was set on a federal level, and the gears of justice were already beginning to turn. The heavy silence of my penthouse was suddenly broken by the sharp vibration of my cell phone resting on the edge of the mahogany desk. The screen illuminated, displaying a new text message from Patricia. It was exactly the kind of arrogant, demanding communication I expected from a woman who believed she held all the power and control. Sunday is tomorrow, the message read, the digital words practically dripping with entitlement and barely contained panic. Bring the $2,000 or do not bother showing your face ever again. We are done playing games with you, Cassidy. She had bumped the immediate cash demand up from $1,500 to $2,000, likely panicking as the Monday default deadline rapidly approached. She was desperately tightening the screws, entirely unaware that the entire structural foundation of her life had already been demolished by my keystrokes. I stared at the message, my reflection visible in the dark glass of the phone screen. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidation. I felt the absolute calm certainty of an apex predator watching its prey willingly step onto the tripwire. They wanted me to show my face. They wanted me to arrive at their house on Sunday and beg for their mercy while handing over my hard-earned money. I unlocked the screen and typed my response with slow, deliberate precision, refusing to engage in her frantic emotional manipulation. I will make sure you get exactly what you are owed, I replied, hitting send before turning the phone completely off. I closed the heavy black binder, the sharp snap of the metal rings echoing loudly in the quiet room. The arsenal was fully loaded, the evidence was incontrovertible, and I was absolutely ready for Sunday. Sunday afternoon arrived with suffocating heat and the nauseating smell of expensive charcoal. Patricia and Richard were not hiding in shame from their impending financial doom. They were celebrating it. They were celebrating the extortion. They had transformed the backyard of my childhood home into a lavish catered barbecue designed entirely to flaunt their imaginary wealth to their country club friends. From my parked rental car down the street, I watched through high-powered binoculars as caterers in crisp white aprons carried trays of grilled oysters and expensive champagne across the manicured lawn. Patricia glided through the crowd in a designer sundress, laughing loudly, playing the perfect suburban hostess. She was celebrating her payday. She genuinely believed that by 5 o'clock, I would walk through that iron gate and hand her the cash they needed to keep their fragile house of cards standing. My father, Richard, stood proudly by the outdoor kitchen holding a crystal glass of scotch, bragging to his golf buddies about his brilliant real estate investments. It was a lie. It was a massive, rotting lie. Every single word out of his mouth was a lie. He was a man drowning in a terminal financial death spiral, yet he smiled as if he owned the world. But the most sickening display came from the patio furniture. Melody and DeAndre were holding court. DeAndre, having fully recovered from his public humiliation at the hands of the police just 2 nights prior, was actively boasting about his latest cryptocurrency yields. He wore a heavy gold watch bought directly with my stolen identity. Melody sat beside him, nodding smugly, sipping a mimosa, telling anyone who would listen about their plans to purchase a second luxury vehicle. They were spending my money. They were spending my credit. They were spending my future. They were literally wearing my stolen credit limit on their wrists. They were so utterly convinced of their untouchable status that they threw a party on the exact edge of their own destruction. They were celebrating while my forged signatures sat securely in a federal database. They were celebrating while the trap snapped shut. The sheer audacity of their greed was a physical weight pressing against the glass of my windshield, but I did not look away. I watched every single smile. I memorized every single laugh. The cruelty was intoxicating to them. The loud, abrasive voice of Aunt Brenda cut through the ambient jazz music playing from the outdoor speakers. Even from a distance, her shrill tone carried perfectly across the pristine lawn. She was standing in a tight circle of gossiping neighbors, holding a plate of catered food, and enthusiastically tearing my professional and personal reputation completely to shreds. I adjusted the audio receiver I had quietly placed in the rhododendron bushes earlier that morning, letting her toxic words stream directly into my earpiece. Aunt Brenda loudly declared to the group that I was a massive disappointment, who had finally been put in my absolute place. She practically shouted that I was probably sitting in my car right now, scraping together my last pennies, crying, and preparing to crawl up the driveway on my hands and knees to beg for my mother's forgiveness. She told them I was a selfish brat who refused to help my struggling parents until they finally laid down the law. The neighbors shook their heads in synchronized judgmental agreement, sipping their drinks and praising Patricia for being so strong, so resolute, and so brave. They all waited with bated breath for the main event. They wanted a show. They wanted to see the arrogant, independent daughter brutally humbled in front of the entire country club elite. They wanted me broken. They wanted me broken. They wanted me completely, irrevocably broken. The psychological abuse was no longer hidden behind closed doors. It was a spectator sport. Every single person in that backyard was complicit in my destruction. They fed on the drama. They fed on the cruelty. They fed on the absolute lie my parents had so carefully constructed over the last 20 years. At exactly 4 in the afternoon, the heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed aggressively against the solid oak. The sharp metallic sound echoed all the way through the grand hallway and out into the backyard, instantly silencing the jazz music and the clinking of champagne flutes. Patricia's face instantly lit up with a smug, victorious smile. She turned to her captivated audience, loudly announcing that the guest of honor had finally arrived to settle her overdue debts. She smoothed down the fabric of her designer sundress, grabbed her crystal glass, and marched confidently through the house toward the foyer. She fully expected to open the door and find me standing there with a defeated posture, red eyes, and a $2,000 cashier's check in my shaking hand. She wanted her victory lap. She wanted her ultimate triumph. She wanted to savor the precise moment my independence shattered. She yanked the heavy front door open, an arrogant, practiced sneer already forming perfectly on her lips. But I was not standing on the welcome mat. The sneer instantly vanished from Patricia's face, replaced by a sudden jarring pale shock. The color completely drained from her cheeks. Standing on her pristine porch was a fully uniformed sheriff's deputy, his hand resting casually on his heavy-duty utility belt. Standing right next to him was a stern, uncompromising process server holding a massive, terrifying stack of thick manila envelopes. Patricia froze completely, her champagne glass trembling violently in her grip, threatening to shatter against the stone porch. The deputy asked her to confirm her identity in a loud, booming voice that echoed straight through the open house and out into the suddenly silent backyard. Everyone heard him. The payday had arrived, but I was not the one paying the price. The bill was finally due. The bill was finally due. and I was going to ensure they paid every single cent. The uniformed deputy stepped forward, his imposing frame completely blocking Patricia from retreating into the safety of her grand foyer. "Are you Patricia Lawson?" he asked, his voice completely devoid of emotion, cutting sharply through the thick, humid suburban air. Patricia could only manage a weak, trembling nod. Her carefully constructed facade of wealthy, untouchable arrogance vanished in a single heartbeat, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. The process server standing next to the deputy did not offer a polite greeting or a sympathetic smile. He simply stepped past the officer and forcefully pressed a massive, heavy stack of thick manila folders directly into Patricia's chest, forcing her to grab them with both hands or let them scatter humiliatingly across the stone porch. "You have been officially served," the process server stated loudly, stepping back and raising a small digital camera. A bright flash illuminated Patricia's terrified, pale face as he documented the legal handover for the court records. The guests in the backyard were now dead silent, the clinking of champagne flutes entirely stopping as they strained their necks to witness the spectacle. Patricia looked down at the massive stack of paper, her manicured nails digging into the manila covers. She initially assumed it was a civil lawsuit from one of her many maxed-out credit card companies. But as her eyes finally focused on the bold, stark red font stamped across the very first page, her knees nearly buckled underneath her. It was not a standard debt collection notice. It was a formal, legally binding 3-day notice to pay or quit. It was a catastrophic, immediate eviction mandate. The legal language printed beneath the red banner was brutal and direct. It stated that the current occupants of the property were in severe, incurable violation of their master lease agreement and were legally ordered to vacate the premises entirely within 72 hours. If they failed to surrender the keys and remove their personal belongings by Wednesday afternoon, the sheriff's department was already authorized to return, physically remove them from the property, and place their belongings on the public curb. Patricia gasped, the air completely leaving her lungs. She was physically holding the absolute destruction of her social standing in her shaking hands. The country club friends, who were just praising her strong parenting a moment ago, were now whispering frantically, watching the arrogant hostess of the lavish barbecue get slapped with a ruthless eviction notice on her own front porch. The humiliation was absolute, deeply public, and entirely inescapable. Sensing the sudden, unnatural silence sweeping across his backyard party, Richard shoved his way through the crowd of frozen guests. He stormed down the long hallway, his face flushed with heat and expensive scotch, his leather loafers slapping aggressively against the hardwood floor. "What in the hell is going on out here?" he roared, pushing violently past Patricia and snatching the heavy legal documents right out of her trembling hands. His eyes darted across the bold red letters of the eviction notice, and his initial confusion instantly morphed into explosive, uncontrollable rage. "This is a sick joke," Richard screamed, waving the thick papers frantically at the impassive deputy. "We own this house. You cannot evict a homeowner. This is our private property." He was practically spitting as he yelled, entirely abandoning his refined, wealthy country club persona. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at the process server. "There is a massive legal misunderstanding here. 5 years ago, we were facing a minor foreclosure issue and a private equity firm stepped in and bought our debt. They bailed us out completely. We have an ironclad leaseback agreement with Phoenix Holdings LLC. They hold the deed on paper, but we have the absolute right to remain living here." Richard's voice grew completely unhinged as he demanded answers from the silent officials on his porch. "Who authorized this notice? I want a name right now. I demand to know who the coward is hiding behind this corporate LLC. You tell the executives at Phoenix Holdings that Richard Lawson will be dragging them into federal court first thing Monday morning for illegal harassment. We are not going anywhere." The process server did not flinch, blink, or back away from Richard's aggressive, screaming tirade. He simply reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a heavy silver pen, and tapped the metal tip firmly against the bottom corner of the documents clutched in Richard's sweating fist. "Turn to page 2. The process server instructed, his voice radiating absolute, unshakable authority. "You want to know exactly who authorized the eviction. Read the mandatory corporate disclosures for yourself." Richard aggressively ripped the first page back, his breathing heavy and ragged as he glared at the paper. He scanned the dense legal text detailing the corporate registration, the federal tax identification numbers, and the ownership structure of the entity that currently held the absolute legal deed to the multi-million-dollar property. His eyes hit the center paragraph, and every single ounce of rage instantly evaporated from his body, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror. The physical color drained from his face so fast, he looked as though he were having a massive medical emergency. There, printed in undeniably clear, bold black ink, was the complete executive registry for Phoenix Holdings, LLC. The sole chief executive officer, the exclusive managing member, and the 100% legal owner of the private equity firm that had bailed them out of foreclosure half a decade ago, was Cassidy. The name stared back at him like a loaded weapon. The daughter he had constantly mocked. The daughter he had kicked out of her own childhood bedroom to make space for a scam artist. The daughter he had just tried to viciously extort for $80,000. I was not just a forensic accountant. I was Phoenix Holdings, LLC. I was the unseen private investor who secretly saved them from the streets 5 years ago, and I was the absolute legal owner of the very ground they were standing on. They were not homeowners. They were my legally bound tenants, and their lease was officially permanently terminated. Through the earpiece in my rental car, I listened to the absolute catastrophic collapse of my family's suburban kingdom. The country club guests did not offer their sympathies. They did not stay to comfort Patricia or defend Richard's damaged honor. The moment the word eviction hung in the humid air alongside the declined credit cards, the wealthy neighbors scattered like cockroaches exposed to a sudden blinding light. The heavy iron gate clanged shut repeatedly as the guests rushed to their luxury vehicles, desperate to distance themselves from the sudden radioactive stench of poverty, failure, and federal fraud. On the patio, the suffocating silence was broken only by Richard's heavy, labored breathing. He was still staring at the second page of the massive legal packet, his mind violently rewinding the last half-decade of his life. 5 years. Richard whispered, his voice cracking, broadcast directly into my ear through the hidden microphone. 5 years ago, we were completely bankrupt. The bank was foreclosing on this exact property. We were days away from being thrown onto the street with absolutely nothing to our names. He looked up at Patricia, his eyes wide with a horrifying, sickening realization. That private investor, that wealthy anonymous savior who swooped in, bought the house in a cash short sale and let us stay. It was Cassidy. It was her the entire time. Patricia let out a guttural, wretched sob that tore through the audio feed. We told everyone it was a prestigious downtown equity firm. She wailed, her pristine, perfectly curated image permanently shattered in front of her peers. We bragged to the entire country club that a wealthy anonymous investor loved our property management skills so much they begged us to maintain the estate. We lived here absolutely rent-free for 5 years because we thought we had outsmarted a faceless, bureaucratic corporation. Richard dropped the heavy eviction notice onto the glass patio table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. She let us live here for free, he muttered, the sheer weight of his own profound stupidity crushing him into the stone bench. She secretly bought the house to save us from homelessness. And we kicked her out of her own childhood bedroom to make space for DeAndre. We treated her like a worthless freeloader. We just tried to viciously extort her for $80,000 to pay off DeAndre's stolen debt. We tried to charge our own landlord back rent. The crushing irony of their situation entirely paralyzed them. They had spent half a decade aggressively biting the only hand that had ever fed them entirely, unaware that the hand held the absolute legal power to crush them into fine dust. Melody was crying hysterically in the background, begging DeAndre to fix the frozen cryptocurrency accounts. But DeAndre remained entirely mute, staring blankly at his dead phone screen. The legal packet, resting on the patio table, was not just an eviction notice. It was a comprehensive, inescapable financial reckoning. Through my encrypted audio feed, I heard the sharp rustle of heavy paper as Patricia frantically flipped past the notice to quit. "What is this?" she gasped, her voice trembling violently as she held up a secondary document. "There is another legal form attached." I smiled coldly behind the steering wheel of my rental car. It was the counter invoice For 5 years, I had quietly absorbed the massive property taxes, the routine maintenance costs, and the heavy burden of their living expenses, asking for absolutely nothing in return except basic human decency. They entirely failed to provide even that bare minimum. By aggressively attempting to extort me, stealing my identity, and proudly claiming the title of landlords, they had legally opened the door for a full retroactive financial adjustment. Richard grabbed the thick invoice from Patricia's shaking hands. He read the itemized ledger out loud, his voice growing fainter and more terrified with every single syllable. "She is billing us," he choked out, completely unable to process the astronomical numbers printed on the page. "She is billing us for 5 years of retroactive back rent." I had calculated the exact fair market rental value of the sprawling suburban property with absolute forensic precision. I factored in the premium upgrades, the massive backyard pool, and the highly exclusive neighborhood zip code. I multiplied that strict monthly rate by 60 individual months. The grand total, printed boldly at the bottom of the ledger, was a staggering $150,000. Because they had actively and willingly violated the original protective leaseback agreement by committing federal wire fraud and severe identity theft on the premises. The leniency clauses that allowed them to live rent-free were entirely and permanently null and void. The massive invoice was fully itemized, legally binding, and immediately payable upon receipt. They had smugly tried to trap me with a fabricated $2,000 extortion demand. I had countered their pathetic strike by legally dropping a $150,000 anvil directly onto their fragile, broken financial lives. They had no available credit left to borrow against. They had no cash reserves hidden away. Their offshore accounts were completely seized by the federal government. They had absolutely no way out of the trap I had built. I listened intently, my breathing perfectly steady, as Richard's terrified eyes reached the very bottom of the heavy invoice. I had strictly instructed my legal team to add one specific, highly personalized note to the final page of the document. It was not a standard legal threat or boilerplate corporate jargon. It was a direct, inescapable mirror deliberately placed to reflect their own monstrous greed right back at their faces. Richard read the bright yellow highlighted sentence out loud, his voice reduced to a hollow, completely defeated whisper. "From now on, I am adding 10% interest every month, just like a real landlord." It was the exact phrase Patricia had smugly hurled at me across the dining room table when she demanded my emergency fund just a few days ago. It was the ultimate devastating echo of her own blind arrogance. She had desperately wanted to play the role of a ruthless, uncompromising landlord. Now, she was finally going to experience exactly what happens when a real landlord decides to forcefully collect. I reached forward and pressed the power button on the audio receiver. The feed went completely silent. I did not need to hear them cry or beg. I put the rental car into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving my family entirely trapped in the financial slaughterhouse they had eagerly built with their own hands. I did not drive far. I pulled the rental car into an empty parking lot just 3 blocks away from the estate and put the transmission in park. I had turned off the hidden audio receiver, but I still had full administrative access to the property's hardwired high-definition security camera system. As the legal owner of the estate, I had installed those exterior cameras years ago to protect my investment. I opened the application on my dashboard console and selected the main patio feed. The live video loaded instantly, providing a crystal-clear, silent window into the absolute wreckage I had just left behind. Richard was standing exactly where the process server had left him. His hands were shaking so violently that he could no longer hold the thick stack of legal documents. He dropped the massive packet. It hit the glass patio table with a heavy visible impact, scattering the eviction notice and the $150,000 invoice across the stone tiles. The initial wave of wealthy neighbors had already fled, but a few core country club elites, including Aunt Brenda, had lingered near the outdoor kitchen, paralyzed by the sheer shock of the confrontation. Aunt Brenda, entirely unable to resist her own insatiable appetite for gossip, slowly walked over to the patio table. She stared down at the scattered papers, her eyes scanning the bold red letters of the eviction mandate and the highlighted corporate registry proving I was the sole owner of the property. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. She turned to the remaining guests and whispered the devastating truth. Patricia and Richard were not wealthy homeowners. They were broke, desperate tenants who had been living entirely on my charity for half a decade. The illusion of their suburban royalty shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. There was no more yelling. There was no more jazz music. The barbecue ended in an agonizing, deeply humiliating silence. The hired caterers awkwardly began packing up the expensive trays of untouched oysters and champagne, trying to make as little noise as possible. Aunt Brenda and the final stragglers did not offer any words of comfort. They simply turned their backs on my sobbing mother and walked silently toward the heavy iron gate, completely severing their social ties with the disgraced couple. Patricia was left sitting alone on the stone bench, weeping into her hands, as the absolute reality of her public destruction settled over the empty backyard. My cell phone suddenly lit up the dark cabin of the rental car, violently vibrating against the center console. The caller ID flashed brightly, displaying Patricia's name. The panic had officially set in. I did not reach for the phone. I sat perfectly still and let it ring until the automated voicemail system took over. 2 minutes later, it rang again. Then a third time. Then a fourth. My mother was frantically blowing up my phone, launching a desperate, chaotic digital assault. I synced the voicemail transcripts to my dashboard screen, watching the artificial intelligence perfectly transcribe her rapid psychological unraveling. Her first message was a display of pure, unhinged, screaming rage. She demanded that I answer the phone immediately, threatening to call the police and have me arrested for fraudulent real estate practices, completely ignoring the fact that I held the absolute legal deed to the property. She called me a monster and a psychopath, screaming that the eviction notice was a pathetic, illegal bluff. 10 minutes later, the anger entirely vanished, instantly replaced by a sickening, high-pitched, sobbing manipulation. The second transcript rolled across my screen, filled with desperate pleas and heavy weeping. She cried about how she carried me in her womb, how family is supposed to stick together during hard times, and how I could not possibly be so cruel as to put my own aging parents out on the street. She begged me to come back to the house so we could sit down and work this out like a loving family. It was a textbook oscillating cycle of narcissistic abuse, rapidly swinging from vicious threats to pathetic victimhood in a desperate attempt to find a pressure point. She was wildly grasping at the air, searching for any emotional lever she could pull to regain her lost control. I felt absolutely nothing. I highlighted every single incoming call and pressed a single button on the dashboard interface, routing her phone number and Richard's phone number directly to a silent, blocked folder. They had lost their direct line to me forever. I returned my attention to the live security camera feed illuminating my console. On the patio, the dynamic was shifting rapidly from despair to frantic, terrified survival. DeAndre was pacing aggressively back and forth across the stone tiles, his hands waving wildly in the air as he cornered Richard and Patricia. The federal asset freeze had entirely destroyed his offshore cryptocurrency accounts, and the declined credit cards proved his stolen identity scheme had collapsed. I was utterly terrified. His endless supply of stolen cash and his luxurious rent-free housing arrangement were evaporating right in front of his eyes. I turned the camera audio feed back on, just in time to hear him hatching his desperate counterattack. He leaned over the glass table, pointing a shaking finger at the scattered eviction papers. "This is just an intimidation tactic," DeAndre insisted loudly, trying to project a false sense of authority. "She is trying to scare us out of the house. We cannot let her win. She works at that prestigious accounting firm downtown, right? She cares about her professional reputation more than anything else." He looked at Richard, his eyes wide with manic desperation. "We storm her corporate office tomorrow morning. First thing Monday. We walk right past security into her department, and we cause a massive, undeniable public scene in front of her wealthy clients and her senior partners. We expose her. We tell everyone she is illegally evicting her own parents. She will be so terrified of the public embarrassment and the HR nightmare that she will drop the eviction notice and cancel the invoice right on the spot." Richard nodded slowly, his posture straightening as he foolishly grasped at this final pathetic lifeline. They actually believed they could outmaneuver me. They believed that public embarrassment was my weakness. They were entirely unaware that I did not just work at the downtown forensic accounting firm. I was the senior managing partner, and I owned the entire floor. I smiled, turning off the camera feed and putting the car into gear. I was going to gladly welcome them to my office tomorrow. Monday morning arrived with the sharp, crisp efficiency of the financial district. The main lobby of my firm was a sprawling masterpiece of imported white marble, brushed steel, and acoustic paneling designed to absorb sound and project absolute intimidating wealth. At exactly 9 o'clock, the serene atmosphere was violently shattered. The heavy glass revolving doors spun aggressively as Patricia, Richard, and DeAndre marched into the building. They were a chaotic, desperate storm, invading a sanctuary of perfect order. They did not walk to the reception desk with the quiet dignity of legitimate clients. They stormed the desk. Patricia slammed her hands flat against the polished granite counter, her face red and contorted with manufactured outrage. She demanded to see me immediately, screaming at the top of her lungs that I was a criminal who was illegally stealing her family home. Richard stood right beside her, pointing his finger aggressively at the terrified young receptionist, demanding that she call the senior partners down to the lobby so he could expose my supposed corporate fraud. DeAndre paced back and forth behind them, trying to look intimidating in his cheap suit, loudly announcing to the gathering crowd of high-net-worth clients and junior accountants that I was a sociopath who was throwing my own elderly parents onto the street. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted an audience. They desperately wanted an audience to witness my humiliation. They genuinely believed that by creating a massive, uncontrollable scene in the center of my professional kingdom, I would come rushing down in a panic, desperate to save my career, and agree to tear up the eviction notice and the massive back rent invoice, just to make them go away quietly. They thought my reputation was my absolute weakness. They thought they could weaponize my corporate environment against me. They were wrong. They were completely catastrophically wrong. I was sitting at my desk on the 50th floor when my direct line flashed with an emergency alert from the lobby security desk. I did not panic. I did not rush. I took a slow sip of my coffee, adjusted my tailored blazer, and calmly walked to the private executive elevator. The descent was smooth, the glass walls of the elevator car, offering a perfect descending view of the chaos unfolding far below. When the silver doors slid open on the ground floor, I did not sprint toward them to beg for silence. I walked with slow, measured, deliberate steps. The architecture of the lobby was specifically designed for absolute security. Between the reception area and the main elevators stood a massive, impenetrable wall of reinforced glass, security turnstiles, requiring encrypted biometric clearance to pass. I stopped exactly 1 foot behind the heavy glass barrier, folding my hands neatly in front of me. Patricia spotted me immediately. She let out a victorious shriek and lunged toward the turnstiles, expecting me to frantically usher them into a private room to negotiate. Richard and DeAndre followed, slamming their bodies against the locked glass barrier when it refused to yield. "Open this gate right now," Richard commanded, his face purple with rage, completely oblivious to the fact that half the firm was watching him act like a rabid animal. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. In a room full of screaming people, the quietest voice holds all the true power. I leaned slightly toward the glass and spoke with cold, clinical precision. "You are currently standing in a secure, privately owned corporate facility." I stated clearly, my voice carrying just enough to cut through their pathetic shouting. "You are not clients. You do not have an appointment. You are committing criminal trespassing." Patricia gasped, slamming her hand against the glass. We are your parents," she screamed, spitting as she spoke. "We are going straight to your human resources director. We are going to tell your bosses exactly what kind of monster you are. You are going to lose your job today, Cassidy." I looked at her with absolute unfiltered pity. I leaned closer to the gap in the glass. "I do not have a boss, Patricia," I replied, my voice completely dead and hollow. "I am the senior managing partner of this entire division. I own this floor. I am the human resources director. I am the absolute authority here. There is no one above me for you to complain to." The realization struck them like a physical blow. The arrogant confidence completely drained from DeAndre's face, as he suddenly recognized the sheer magnitude of the power dynamic he had just foolishly challenged. I did not wait for them to process their total defeat. I simply raised my right hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the towering head of corporate security standing near the main entrance. The response was immediate and physically overwhelming. 6 heavily armed, uniformed security contractors descended upon the trio. They did not ask them politely to leave. They grabbed Richard by the shoulders, physically spinning him around and marching him toward the exit. They seized DeAndre by the arms, dragging him backward as he violently thrashed and kicked against the polished marble floor. Patricia was escorted by 2 female guards, her screams of outrage turning into high-pitched shrieks of absolute humiliation as she was forcefully frog-marched through the lobby in full view of my elite colleagues and the city's wealthiest clients. As the security team forcefully shoved them through the heavy revolving doors and out onto the unforgiving concrete of the busy downtown street, DeAndre desperately pressed his face against the exterior glass. "I will destroy you," he screamed, his voice muffled by the thick acoustic paneling. "I will find a way to destroy you." I did not even blink. I turned my back on them, swiped my biometric badge, and walked calmly back to my elevator, leaving them permanently locked out in the cold. The humiliating expulsion onto the cold concrete of the financial district did not break DeAndre's ego. It mutated his panic into a reckless, rabid desperation. They were entirely out of time. They were entirely out of money. They were entirely out of options. The 72-hour eviction countdown was ticking loudly in their ears, a relentless drumbeat of impending homelessness. DeAndre knew he could not fight my legal team in a legitimate courtroom. I knew he could not outsmart my federal whistleblower reports. He needed raw, untraceable liquidity, and he needed it before Wednesday afternoon to hire a shadow lawyer capable of burying his massive identity theft footprint. Retreating to the sterile, tense living room of my property, DeAndre and Melody frantically hatched a catastrophic Hail Mary play. They could not use the traditional banking system because every single account tied to my stolen Social Security number was federally frozen. Instead, they weaponized their absolute favorite asset. They weaponized their fake curated social image. Operating with feverish manic speed, they fast-tracked a lavish event they called the Phoenix Valley Charity Gala. It was a complete fabricated lie from the very first concept. They targeted the most gullible, wealthy, tech-illiterate members of the suburban country club, sending out digital encrypted invitations for an exclusive high-society fundraising dinner. The stated goal was to raise emergency capital for a non-existent children's hospital wing. The actual hidden goal was a massive, devastating cryptocurrency rug pull. DeAndre planned to corner the wealthy investors in a room fueled by cheap champagne and high-pressure sales tactics, convince them to transfer massive amounts of liquid cash into his newly minted unregulated digital coin, and then immediately vanish with the funds the second the event concluded. I intended to drain the retirement accounts of their closest friends to finance his legal defense against me. It was a spectacular, breathtaking display of pure, unadulterated greed. They were doubling down on their fraud. They were doubling down on their lies. They were doubling down on the exact criminal behavior that had trapped them in my snare in the first place. Melody enthusiastically supported the scam, aggressively working her phone contacts and leveraging every single ounce of her fake charm to guarantee attendance. She desperately needed to maintain the illusion of being a wealthy, successful entrepreneur's wife. She refused to accept her impending ruin. She refused to accept her poverty. She refused to accept reality. The fatal flaw in their master plan was not the technology. The fatal flaw was their absolute reliance on the social vanity of their inner circle. DeAndre had strictly instructed all invitees to keep the event completely private to avoid regulatory scrutiny. He demanded absolute discretion. But he had completely forgotten to account for the insatiable, pathetic ego of my mother's older sister. Aunt Brenda simply could not help herself. She could not resist the overwhelming, addictive urge to publicly prove she was still adjacent to massive wealth, especially after the humiliating disaster of the Sunday barbecue. While monitoring my digital threat intelligence feeds from the quiet safety of my downtown penthouse, an automated alert suddenly flashed across my monitor. Aunt Brenda had just published a completely public, entirely unencrypted post on her primary Facebook page. She attached a glossy digital rendering of the fake gala invitation, proudly tagging DeAndre and Melody. The caption was a nauseating display of manufactured pride, bragging extensively to her hundreds of followers about her brilliant, highly successful nephew and his unparalleled philanthropy. She praised his charitable heart. She praised his visionary leadership. She praised the very man who was actively plotting to steal her entire pension. Most importantly, she posted the exact physical address of the rented suburban banquet hall, the specific start time of the VIP cocktail hour, and the mandatory dress code. The trap they were desperately trying to build in the dark had just been flooded with stadium lighting. They wanted to execute a quiet, stealthy robbery. Aunt Brenda had just handed me a printed map directly to the crime scene. The sheer stupidity of the mistake was staggering. They were so consumed by their frantic need for survival that they failed to secure their own perimeter. They left the back door completely wide open for the true landlord to walk right through. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety as I read the public post. I did not panic. I did not rush. I sat back in my leather desk chair and smiled. The dominoes were practically begging to be knocked over. If they wanted to host a high society charity gala, I was going to ensure they received the absolute most memorable keynote presentation of their entire pathetic lives. I turned to my heavy-duty office printer and bypassed the wireless network using a hardwired secure connection. I opened the encrypted federal files I had carefully compiled over the last 48 hours. I printed the massive detailed Federal Bureau of Investigation dossier outlining DeAndre's wire fraud. I printed the Internal Revenue Service assets seizure logs. I printed the undeniable forensic proof of Melody's identity theft. I printed the absolute destruction of their entire fictional universe. I gathered the warm, heavy stack of papers and meticulously scanned them onto a sleek, encrypted titanium flash drive. The digital trap was fully loaded. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet, the soft lighting illuminating rows of tailored, immaculate garments. I bypassed the standard business attire. Tonight required a very specific, aggressive aesthetic. I selected a stunning midnight black designer power suit tailored to fit like a second layer of armor. The sharp, structured shoulders and the deep, plunging lapel projected an aura of unapologetic, ruthless authority. I paired the suit with a simple silver chain and a pair of towering, blood-red stilettos that echoed loudly against the hardwood floor with every single step. I applied a sharp, precise layer of dark red lipstick. I looked into the full-length mirror. The frightened, neglected daughter they had bullied out of her bedroom no longer existed. Only the managing partner remained. Only the executioner remained. I slid the titanium flash drive into my clutch, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. I was going to the gala. The rented suburban banquet hall was a masterclass in cheap illusion. Faux gold drapery hung heavily over water-stained drywall, and rented crystal chandeliers cast a dim, deceptive light across the room. I handed my keys to the confused teenage valet, bypassed the unattended reception table, and stood quietly outside the heavy oak double doors of the main ballroom. Through the thick wood, DeAndre's voice boomed over a low-quality public address system. I was currently delivering the performance of a lifetime. He was charming, he was energetic, and he was completely, utterly desperate. I pushed the heavy doors open. They swung inward with a loud, echoing thud that instantly cut through the polite murmurs of the gathered crowd. The room was packed with the exact demographic DeAndre and Melody preyed upon: wealthy, aging suburbanites, country club retirees sitting at round banquet tables, aggressively nodding along as DeAndre paced across the low wooden stage. Behind him, a massive projector screen displayed a completely fabricated line graph showing a bright green arrow rocketing toward the ceiling. He was loudly promising them a guaranteed 400% return on their investment within exactly 30 days. He was promising them absolute financial freedom. He was promising them the exact same lies that had built his entirely fake empire. I was sweating under the stage lights, gripping a wireless microphone with white knuckles. He spoke of blockchain innovation. He spoke of decentralized autonomy. He spoke of a digital future while actively digging a financial grave for every single person sitting in the audience. He was selling them nothing. He was selling them absolute devastating nothing. He was selling them a void. He was selling them the exact same void he had built his entire life around. I did not slip into the room quietly. I walked straight down the center aisle, my blood-red stilettos striking the cheap laminate flooring with the sharp, rhythmic precision of a metronome. Click, click, click. Every single eye in the back of the room turned to look at the sudden intrusion. I was the absolute antithesis of their suburban camouflage. My midnight black power suit absorbed the ambient light, projecting an aura of cold, untouchable authority that immediately shifted the gravity of the room. I was the predator entering a room entirely full of willingly blind sheep. I was the reckoning they had aggressively invited. I was the ghost of their financial ruin made physical, made sharp, made absolute. The disruption of my entrance rippled forward toward the front row. Melody was standing near the edge of the stage, desperately trying to maintain her posture as the supportive, wealthy wife. She held a crystal flute of rented champagne, her eyes glued to the wealthy investors she planned to rob. Then the rhythmic sound of my heels caught her attention. She turned her head. The color violently drained from her face, leaving her looking completely hollow and sickly under the harsh stage lighting. Her fingers went entirely limp. The champagne flute slipped from her grasp, plummeting toward the floor and shattering violently against the hard laminate. The sharp crash of the breaking crystal echoed loudly, causing several heads in the front row to violently flinch. The glass shattered. Her reality shattered. Her stolen, fraudulent identity shattered. DeAndre stumbled over his heavily rehearsed script, his eyes darting toward the sound. He saw me. His voice cracked the microphone, amplifying a pathetic, high-pitched squeak as the absolute terror paralyzed his vocal cords. He stopped pacing. He stopped pitching. He simply stood completely frozen on the stage, a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming federal train. Patricia immediately recognized the catastrophic danger. She leaped up from her front row seat, her faux silk dress rustling aggressively. She darted down the center aisle, her face contorted with a mixture of sheer panic and familiar toxic rage. She closed the distance between us, stepping directly into my path to physically block my advance. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a venomous, frantic whisper intended only for my ears. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging sharply into the expensive fabric of my suit. "You need to leave right now, Cassidy. You need to turn around and walk out those doors. We are in the middle of a massive fundraising drive. This is our last chance to save our family from the disaster you created. You are not going to ruin this for us. You are not going to embarrass us in front of these people." She was shaking violently, oscillating rapidly between aggressive physical intimidation and desperate, pathetic pleading. She pleaded for her image. She pleaded for her scam. She pleaded for the fake royalty she had built on my stolen name. She leaned in closer, her breath smelling of cheap wine and absolute fear. "I am your mother," she growled, attempting to summon a maternal authority that had been dead for over a decade. "I command you to leave this building immediately." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not yell. I did not flinch. I simply stared at her fingers with such profound, freezing contempt that she instinctively pulled her hand back, as if the fabric of my suit had suddenly burned her skin. "You have no authority here," I stated, my voice completely flat and devoid of any human empathy. "You are a tenant facing immediate eviction, and you are currently trespassing in my reality." I effortlessly sidestepped her frozen, trembling form, completely ignoring her frantic, sputtering gasps. I did not walk toward the stage. I did not walk toward DeAndre. I changed my trajectory, walking directly toward the back corner of the ballroom. I was heading straight for the audio-visual control booth, a small elevated desk, entirely unmanned by the cheap venue staff. The absolute destruction of their massive cryptocurrency fraud did not require me to raise my voice or argue with a desperate scammer on a wooden stage. It only required a single encrypted titanium flash drive and an open USB port. I reached the elevated platform of the audiovisual booth with unhurried precision. The lone teenage technician, sitting behind the mixing board, barely had time to look up from his phone before I firmly slid him out of the way, taking control of the main laptop connected to the ceiling projector. He opened his mouth to protest, but a single ice-cold glare from me instantly silenced him. I withdrew the titanium flash drive from my clutch and slid it directly into the open USB port on the side of the machine. The laptop recognized the hardware immediately. I opened the root folder, completely bypassing the venue's standard security protocols, and executed a full-screen override. On the stage, DeAndre was still frozen, his mouth hanging open in a silent display of utter terror as he watched me commandeer the booth. Behind him, the massive projector screen abruptly went completely black. A loud digital hum echoed through the ballroom speakers. The wealthy investors in the audience murmured in confusion, shifting uncomfortably in their banquet chairs. They thought it was a technical glitch. A second later, the massive screen ignited with a blinding high-definition white light. DeAndre's fabricated brightly colored line graphs and his pathetic cryptocurrency logo completely vanished. They were instantly replaced by massive, undeniable high-resolution images of 3 platinum credit card statements. The scale was overwhelming. The numbers were staggering. Stretched across 20 feet of bright canvas were the itemized, heavily fraudulent charges DeAndre and Melody had racked up over the past 6 months. The audience gasped as their eyes adjusted to the stark reality projected in front of them. The statements clearly displayed luxury car rentals, exotic vacations, and massive transfers to unregulated digital wallets. But the most devastating detail was printed in bold, undeniable black ink at the top left corner of every single statement. The name on the heavily defaulted accounts was not DeAndre. The name was not Melody. The name legally bound to the massive fraudulent debt was Cassidy. I zoomed in on the account holder information, the massive text dwarfing DeAndre as he stood helplessly on the stage. The illusion of his immense wealth was completely ripped away, brutally exposing the parasitic reality underneath. He was not a visionary entrepreneur or a charitable philanthropist. He was a common, desperate identity thief currently standing in front of his victims. I picked up the spare wireless microphone resting on the mixing board and clicked the power button. A sharp, clear feedback tone rang out instantly, commanding absolute silence across the packed ballroom. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice in anger or desperation. I spoke with the calm, methodical, surgical precision of a forensic accountant presenting a federal case. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice echoing evenly off the water-stained walls. "The man standing before you on that stage is currently pitching you a revolutionary digital token designed to secure your financial future. I am here to provide you with the full, unredacted prospectus." I slowly walked down the short steps from the AV booth and moved directly into the center aisle, forcing the audience to turn their heads and listen. The man begging for your money is my brother-in-law. The massive debt you see projected on the screen behind him is a direct result of severe, documented identity theft. He did not build a digital empire. He stole my social security number to fund a fake, lavish lifestyle he could never actually afford. The crowd erupted into frantic, horrified whispers. Several wealthy retirees immediately pulled out their cell phones, desperately checking their own bank accounts. DeAndre frantically waved his hands, pleading into his own microphone, claiming the documents were fabricated, but his voice cracked, betraying his absolute guilt. I did not stop. I clicked a button on a wireless remote, advancing to the next slide. Massive bank records appeared showing the direct flow of stolen cash. And his fraud was not a solo operation. I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. Sitting right here in the front row are my parents, Patricia and Richard. They fully aided and abetted this criminal enterprise. When DeAndre ran out of stolen credit, my parents attempted to violently extort me for $80,000 to cover his losses, aggressively leveraging the house they believed they owned. They lied to every single one of you. They bragged about an anonymous investor saving them from bankruptcy 5 years ago. I am that investor. I bought that house, and I served them with a 3-day eviction notice yesterday afternoon. They are broke. They are desperate. And this entire charity gala is nothing but a frantic, unregulated Ponzi scheme designed to drain your retirement funds to pay for their federal criminal defense. The ballroom descended into absolute terrified chaos. Guests were violently shoving their chairs back, abandoning their cheap champagne and rushing toward the exit doors. Melody burst into tears on the floor, realizing her entire social existence was permanently annihilated. Patricia buried her face in her hands, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her public execution. I raised the remote and clicked the button one final time. The massive screen shifted away from the credit card statements. The final image was a stark, brutal, undeniable government document. It was the official Internal Revenue Service asset freeze warning, complete with the massive imposing federal seal. The red text spanning the screen confirmed that every single digital wallet, bank account, and corporate entity tied to DeAndre's fake charity had been formally seized, pending a massive wire fraud indictment. The proof was absolute, legally binding, and completely devastating. DeAndre dropped his microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a loud, pathetic thud that echoed through the room. He had nowhere left to run. He had no one left to steal from. The federal government had locked the final door, and I had just thrown away the key in front of everyone he ever knew. The absolute finality of the federal seal hanging over the stage acted like a chemical catalyst, instantly igniting the room into absolute uncontained hysteria. The polite murmurs of wealthy retirees violently transformed into a deafening roar of outrage and panic. These were not amateur investors. These were ruthless suburban country club veterans who guarded their retirement portfolios with vicious intensity, and they suddenly realized they had just been herded into a slaughterhouse by a cheap, sweating con artist. Men in expensive dinner jackets surged forward, abandoning their tables and storming the edge of the wooden stage. They demanded their money back immediately. They demanded untraceable wire reversals. They demanded the head of the man who had just tried to rob them blind. DeAndre completely shattered under the immense crushing weight of their fury. The slick, arrogant social media hustler persona he had meticulously curated for years instantly dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, trembling child in a cheap, sweat-soaked suit. He backed away from the edge of the stage, holding his hands up in a frantic, pathetic gesture of surrender. He stammered wildly, desperately, trying to spit out rehearsed buzzwords about market volatility and temporary liquidity freezes, but his voice was entirely drowned out by the sheer volume of the mob. A heavy crystal water glass flew from the back of the room, shattering violently against the projector screen right between DeAndre and the massive federal warning. He shrieked, physically ducking and covering his head, as more angry investors swarmed the stage steps. He had spent his entire adult life aggressively stealing from the vulnerable, hiding behind the digital anonymity of the internet. Now, the physical reality of his massive financial crimes had finally cornered him in a brightly lit room, and the people he had tried to exploit were ready to tear him apart with their bare hands. He looked toward Melody for help, but she was entirely paralyzed, sobbing uncontrollably on the cheap laminate floor as the furious crowd completely ignored her. DeAndre was utterly alone. While DeAndre faced the physical wrath of the scammed investors, Patricia was experiencing a completely different, far more agonizing execution. She remained frozen in the front row, her faux silk dress suddenly feeling like a heavy, suffocating shroud. She desperately looked around the chaotic ballroom, her wide, panicked eyes searching frantically for a single friendly face, a single lifeline to pull her out of the wreckage. She locked eyes with Aunt Brenda, who was standing perfectly still near the abandoned champagne fountain. Patricia took a hopeful, trembling step toward her sister, raising a shaking hand in a pathetic plea for family solidarity. Aunt Brenda did not move to comfort her. Aunt Brenda did not offer a sympathetic shoulder. Aunt Brenda looked at Patricia, looked at the massive federal asset seizure warning projected on the wall, and felt the sudden toxic radiation of absolute poverty. In the ruthless, hyper-competitive ecosystem of their modern suburban social circle, failure was an infectious disease, and Patricia had just become patient zero. Aunt Brenda slowly lowered her own champagne glass to a passing tray. She looked her sister dead in the eye, her expression completely devoid of familial love or basic human warmth. The rejection was absolute. The rejection was complete. The rejection was eternal. Aunt Brenda turned her back aggressively, pulling her wealthy husband by the arm. and marched directly toward the heavy oak exit doors without saying a single word. The rest of the country club elite immediately followed her lead. The women who had praised Patricia's elegant landscaping just a few days ago now refused to even glance in her direction. They physically stepped around her as if she were a piece of rotting garbage left on the ballroom floor. They were abandoning her to the legal and financial slaughterhouse. Patricia collapsed back into her cheap banquet chair, her breathing shallow and frantic. This was the ultimate social death. She had spent her entire life stepping on the necks of everyone around her, including her own daughter, purely to maintain the illusion of elite superiority. Now the mask was violently ripped away, exposing her as a broke, desperate fraud, facing an inevitable federal indictment. She had absolutely nothing left. No money, no home, no family, no friends. Just the deafening roar of the angry mob and the cold, unyielding reality of her complete destruction. I watched the pandemonium unfold with absolute chilling detachment. The room was a hurricane of screaming investors, shattered glass, and completely shattered egos. I had initiated the violent storm, but I did not need to stay to watch the floodwaters rise. I reached over the mixing board and cleanly pulled my titanium flash drive from the side of the venue's laptop. The massive federal warning on the projector screen vanished, leaving DeAndre completely exposed under the harsh, blinding stage lights as the mob finally breached the wooden platform. I handed the wireless microphone back to the terrified teenage audiovisual technician, giving him a brief, polite nod of professional courtesy. I turned my back on the stage, stepping smoothly down the short stairs and walking straight down the center aisle. I did not look at DeAndre pleading for his life. I did not look at Melody weeping on the floor. I did not look at Patricia suffering her permanent, agonizing social death. My red stilettos clicked rhythmically against the laminate floor, a steady, uncompromising cadence cutting through the chaos. I pushed the heavy oak double doors open and walked out into the cool, quiet night air, leaving them to drown in the absolute ruin they had built. Wednesday morning broke over the suburban estate, not with warmth, but with a cold, suffocating gray light that mirrored the absolute desolation inside. It was day 3. The 72-hour legal grace period was officially and permanently over. Inside the sprawling house, the power had finally been cut by the utility companies at my strict legal directive, plunging the massive estate into absolute darkness. Patricia and Richard moved through the oppressive, freezing shadows of the grand living room like hollow, defeated ghosts, haunting a graveyard of their own making. They were frantically stuffing their expensive clothes, framed photographs, and meaningless porcelain trinkets into cheap cardboard boxes, illuminated only by the weak, dying flashlights on their cell phones. The physical exertion of packing was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing, agonizing psychological weight of the gala disaster playing on an endless loop in their minds. The memory of the rented ballroom tore through Patricia's psyche. The screaming mob, the shattered crystal, the absolute unyielding rejection of Aunt Brenda, the complete annihilation of her social empire. She taped a box shut, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold the plastic dispenser. She had lost everything. She had lost her status. She had lost her friends. She had lost her home. The repetition of her monumental losses echoed endlessly in her fractured mind, a relentless hammer striking the final nails into her coffin. Richard did not speak. He did not offer any comfort or false hope. He simply dragged the heavy sealed boxes toward the front door, his face pale, deeply lined, and completely drained of the arrogant, wealthy patriarch persona he had weaponized for decades. The silence in the house was heavy. The silence was absolute. The silence was the deafening sound of their own self-inflicted ruin. They jumped at every single creak of the floorboards, utterly terrified of the inevitable knock on the massive wooden front door. They fully expected the local county sheriff to arrive with a standard moving crew to physically throw their belongings onto the public curb. They were mentally preparing for the brutal, humiliating, but ultimately civil eviction. They were entirely unprepared for the actual world-ending nightmare roaring down their quiet suburban street. The arrival of the authorities did not begin with a polite, measured knock. It began with the aggressive synchronized roar of heavy high-performance engines violently breaking the quiet morning air. A fleet of massive jet-black government SUVs turned sharply off the main road and aggressively breached the perimeter of the estate without slowing down. They did not park neatly on the circular concrete driveway to respect the landscaping. The heavy, armored vehicles drove directly up over the curbs, their massive, thick tires violently tearing through Patricia's pristine award-winning flower beds and crushing the perfectly manicured front lawn into deep, muddy, ruined trenches. The vehicles formed a tactical, impenetrable blockade across the entire front of the property, their blinding red and blue emergency lights cutting through the gray morning fog in chaotic, frantic flashes. Richard dropped a cardboard box in the foyer, the heavy thud completely masked by the terrifying sound of a dozen slamming vehicle doors. This was not a standard civil eviction detail executing a simple property notice. The men and women pouring out of the black SUVs were not local county deputies. They were heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical body armor, vividly emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. They moved with terrifying, absolute military precision, fanning out to secure every single exit. The lead agent marched directly up the front steps, entirely bypassing the doorbell, and hammered his heavy, reinforced fist against the expensive oak door with enough force to rattle the heavy glass windows. Federal agents opened the door immediately. The man bellowed, his voice carrying an undeniable, terrifying, world-ending authority. Richard backed away, his legs giving out entirely as he collapsed backward onto a packed box. The massive door was forcefully breached before Patricia could even formulate a scream. Dozens of highly trained agents flooded the dark foyer, sweeping through the expansive house with brutal efficiency. The lead agent stood firmly in the center of the living room, holding a thick, legally binding federal search and seizure warrant. The document was not built on mere suspicion or circumstantial evidence. It was built entirely on the massive, impenetrable forensic dossier I had meticulously compiled, printed, and handed directly to their field office. The federal trap had formally and permanently snapped shut. DeAndre stumbled out of the downstairs guest bedroom, wearing cheap sweatpants and a frantic, utterly terrified expression. He did not even have time to raise his hands or formulate a single lie before two federal agents grabbed him violently, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the expensive hallway wallpaper. The cold, unforgiving steel of the heavy handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists, permanently locking his hands behind his back. The absolute, inescapable reality of his massive wire fraud and severe identity theft had finally arrived to aggressively collect its due. Melody erupted from the bedroom directly behind him, screaming hysterically as she witnessed her husband being physically detained and read his federal rights. Her shrieks of terror rapidly morphed into agonizing, unhinged wails of pure devastation as a specialized team of IRS agents began ruthlessly sweeping her massive walk-in closet. They were not there for her clothes. They were systematically seizing every single designer handbag, every piece of diamond jewelry, and every luxury watch as legally documented evidence of illicit, fraudulently obtained funds. Melody dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably as agents carried her entire fake stolen identity out the front door in clear plastic evidence bags. As the federal agents systematically stripped the house of its fraudulent luxury, a second group of uniformed officers forcefully pushed their way into the chaotic foyer. The local county sheriff and his eviction detail had patiently waited on the perimeter while the Federal Bureau of Investigation executed their massive criminal warrants. Now it was their turn to execute the civil mandate. The lead sheriff did not offer a polite greeting. He did not show a single ounce of sympathy for the weeping, hyperventilating family, currently surrounded by armed federal agents. He walked directly up to Richard, who was still slumped, completely defeated against the hallway wall, and unrolled a thick, bright orange legal document. Your 72-hour grace period expired at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, the sheriff stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising instrument of the law. You are currently in illegal possession of this property. The legal deed and the absolute right of occupancy belong entirely and exclusively to Phoenix Holdings LLC. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings you can physically carry and exit the premises. If you are still standing inside this structure, when that 15-minute timer expires, you will be placed in handcuffs for criminal trespassing and transported to the county jail. The brutal, unforgiving reality of the deadline struck Patricia like a physical blow. 15 minutes. She had exactly 15 minutes to condense 5 years of suburban royalty into whatever she could carry in her bare hands. She frantically spun around in circles, her eyes darting across the grand living room, completely paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the demand. She tried to grab a heavy silver candelabra, but a deputy immediately slapped his hand down on the metal base, sternly reminding her that all fixtures and high-value assets were legally frozen, pending my retroactive rent collection. She tried to pull a designer coat from the front closet, but an IRS agent forcefully blocked her path, scanning the garment for federal evidence tags. They were entirely trapped in a coordinated, inescapable vice. The federal government was aggressively taking their freedom, and the local government was forcefully taking their shelter. Richard did not even attempt to fight. He slowly pushed himself off the floor, his entire body trembling with absolute defeat. He grabbed the single cardboard box he had managed to pack before the raid and began walking toward the shattered front door, his head hung low in ultimate permanent surrender. Patricia stumbled out onto the ruined, muddy front lawn, her arms desperately wrapped around a single flimsy cardboard box filled with her imported fine china. The cold, damp morning air violently bit through her thin faux silk dress, but she could not feel the physical chill. She was completely numb. She stood frozen on the trampled grass and watched the absolute mechanical efficiency of her permanent removal. Heavy commercial locksmith vans had already pulled into the driveway, completely ignoring the massive trenches dug by the federal vehicles. Men in thick canvas jackets marched up the front steps, holding heavy-duty power drills. Patricia watched the drill bits bite aggressively into the polished brass locks of the massive oak doors. The high-pitched whine of the drills cutting through the metal echoed loudly across the empty neighborhood. She watched the deadbolts shatter. She watched the handles fall. She watched the locks change on the exact same house she had aggressively pretended to own for half a decade. Every single turning gear, every single falling piece of brass was a deliberate, violent execution of her false reality. The heavy iron gates were chained shut. The thick wooden doors were permanently sealed. The massive, sprawling estate that had hosted her lavish country club barbecues was now an impenetrable fortress completely locked against her. She looked down at the muddy grass staining her expensive shoes. The crushing, suffocating reality of her total destruction finally crashed down upon her with inescapable force. The federal agents had formally impounded their leased luxury vehicles as part of the massive asset seizure. The banks had entirely frozen their checking accounts to cover the massive unpaid overdrafts. The credit cards were completely destroyed. They had absolutely $0 in liquid cash. They had absolutely no transportation. They had absolutely nowhere to go. The wealthy friends from the country club had completely abandoned them the night before. Aunt Brenda had permanently severed all ties. They were entirely alone, standing on a muddy curb, holding cardboard boxes, while the federal agents hauled their favorite son-in-law into a black transport vehicle. The sheer terrifying repetition of her losses spiraled endlessly in her mind. She had nothing, she had no one. She had nowhere to hide. Patricia sank to her knees in the wet, ruined grass, the heavy box of fine china resting precariously on her lap. She looked at Richard, who was staring blankly at the pavement, completely broken and hollowed out. She looked at Melody, who was sitting on the curb in handcuffs screaming as a federal agent officially read her Miranda rights. In the absolute freezing depths of her despair, a singular, horrifying realization slowly crystallized in Patricia's frantic mind. She had spent her entire life aggressively burning bridges to maintain her illusion of absolute superiority. She had alienated every single person who had ever offered her genuine help. And now, at the absolute bottom of the abyss, there was only one person left in the entire world who possessed the financial resources and the legal authority to save them from total annihilation. The only person with power was the exact same person she had viciously kicked out of her childhood bedroom. The only person with money was the exact same person she had ruthlessly tried to extort for $80,000 just a few days ago. The only lifeline remaining was Cassidy. Patricia gripped the cardboard box, her knuckles turning completely white. The absolute crushing humiliation of needing the daughter she had always despised became her final agonizing punishment. The cold, relentless rain of the downtown financial district washed away the final remnants of their suburban royalty. It was late Friday night. The neon lights of the city reflected off the wet pavement, casting long, distorted shadows across the towering steel and glass facade of my luxury penthouse building. Patricia, Richard, and Melody stood huddled together under the massive, imposing security awning. Melody had been released on a temporary federal bond, completely stripped of her passports, her designer clothes, and her stolen dignity. She was shivering violently in a cheap, oversized county jail sweatshirt, her makeup running down her face in dark, muddy streaks. They were soaking wet. They were completely exhausted. They were absolutely broken. Patricia reached out with a trembling, pale finger and pressed the glowing silver button on the high-security intercom panel. She pressed it once. She pressed it twice. She pressed it frantically, obsessively, desperately trying to force a connection that had been dead for over a decade. The repetition was her only remaining weapon against the absolute silence of the building. The loud digital ringtone echoed endlessly into the cold night air. The heavy, impenetrable glass doors of the lobby stood locked before them, a physical manifestation of the permanent barrier I had constructed. Richard leaned heavily against the wet concrete pillar, staring blankly at the buzzing intercom. The arrogant patriarch who had proudly evicted me from my childhood bedroom was entirely gone. In his place stood a hollow, defeated old man who could not even afford a warm cup of coffee, let alone a roof for his weeping wife. Melody began to sob loudly, wrapping her arms around her own chest, terrified of the loud city traffic and the aggressive reality of the streets. They had no hotel reservations because their credit was completely destroyed. They had no cash for a cab because the federal agents had seized every single digital wallet. They had walked miles in the freezing rain to reach my building. The intercom buzzed again, a harsh mechanical sound cutting through the rhythmic splashing of passing cars. Patricia leaned her forehead against the cold metal panel. The realization of their absolute vulnerability settled into her bones. They were standing on the exact same streets they had threatened to throw me onto 5 years ago. The digital indicator on the intercom panel finally flashed green, signaling an open audio channel. Patricia practically collapsed against the speaker, her voice tearing through the microphone in a desperate, ragged wail. "Cassidy, please," she sobbed, the sheer panic vibrating in her throat. "We are homeless. The federal agents took the cars. They took the bank accounts. We have absolutely nothing left. DeAndre is in a federal holding cell. They denied his bail. They are going to lock him away for decades." She gripped the metal edges of the call box, her knuckles white, her desperation mutating into a pathetic, transparent manipulation. "We are a family, Cassidy. We are your family. You cannot just leave us out here in the cold like stray dogs. We can fix this. We can sit down like mature adults and fix this entire misunderstanding." Her voice rapidly oscillated between genuine, terrified weeping and the deeply ingrained, toxic arrogance she could never fully abandon. "I know things got completely out of hand yesterday," Patricia pleaded, completely minimizing the massive orchestrated extortion attempt. "But we forgive you. Do you hear me, Cassidy? We forgive you for the eviction. We forgive you for calling the authorities. We can move past all of this. Just buzz the door open. Just let us in for the night and we will sort out the paperwork tomorrow." She was still trying to negotiate from a position of power she did not possess. She was still trying to weaponize her toxic forgiveness. She repeated her delusions, obsessively chanting them into the microphone. "We forgive you. We forgive you. We forgive you." The repetition was not an act of grace. It was a frantic psychological defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative where she was still the merciful mother granting pardons to her disobedient child. Richard stepped closer to the microphone, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Cassidy, please," he whispered. "Your sister is freezing. We are literally begging you. Just unlock the door. I sat in the absolute silent warmth of my penthouse living room, completely untouched by the freezing rain outside. My high-definition security monitors displayed their pathetic soaking wet figures in crystal-clear resolution. I watched Patricia desperately claw at the metal intercom. I watched Melody shivering in her jail-issued sweatshirt. I watched Richard completely broken. I took a slow, measured sip of my expensive dark red vintage wine. The flavor was rich, complex, and entirely satisfying. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I reached forward and pressed the glowing talk button on my executive console. My voice broadcast smoothly and clearly down to the freezing street level, cutting through their chaotic sobbing with the absolute chilling finality of a judge delivering a permanent sentence. "I am not your family," I stated calmly. "I am the landlord you tried to extort. The lease is officially terminated. Do not ever contact me again." I released the button. I reached across the console and permanently disabled the exterior intercom feed. The screens went entirely black. The silence in the penthouse was absolute perfect and finally mine. But absolute silence was too generous for the decades of psychological warfare they had ruthlessly waged against me. I wanted them to carry my absolute finality into the cold, wet gutter. I reached back across the smooth mahogany console and punched the heavy silver manual override button, forcing the exterior speaker back online. The high-definition screens flickered back to life, revealing Patricia still clinging to the metal call box, her tear-streaked face looking up in sudden, desperate hope. She thought I was relenting. She thought her toxic forgiveness had actually worked. I shattered that pathetic illusion with a calm, freezing precision. "You demanded $80,000 as the literal price of my existence in your family," I stated, my voice echoing loudly across the wet, deserted financial district pavement. "You stole my identity. You stole my credit. You stole my peace. You stole my fundamental ability to feel safe. You systematically drained every single account I had painstakingly built, and you treated me like a repulsive parasite while you slept soundly under a roof I paid for." I watched Richard flinch physically at the undeniable truth of my words. I watched Melody bury her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I focused entirely on Patricia, driving the reality of her actions deep into her fractured psyche. Family does not commit federal wire fraud against family. Family does not weaponize the legal system to extort their own children. Family does not leave you drowning in debt while they drink expensive champagne. You are not my family. You are a financial liability that I have officially and permanently liquidated. The repetition of the word family hung in the freezing air, mutating from a word of comfort into a weapon of absolute destruction. You built your entire lavish lifestyle on the broken bones of my credit score. You wore designer clothes bought with my stolen signature. You hosted extravagant country club galas in a house you did not own, paid for by the exact same daughter you aggressively despised. You dug this massive, inescapable grave with your own sheer greed, and now you are going to lie in it. Your suburban empire was nothing but a fragile paper castle built on my stolen foundation, and now the storm has finally come to blow it all away. I am adding 10% interest to the absolute peace of mind I am taking back from you tonight. Consider that 10% a mandatory late fee for the 5 years of intense, relentless psychological torment you subjected me to. Do not attempt to call me again. Do not attempt to write to me. Do not ever show your faces near my property. See you in civil court for the $150,000 in accumulated back rent. I released the silver intercom button abruptly and violently, cutting off Patricia's hysterical, piercing wails mid-sentence. I did not look at the security screens again to watch their reaction. I picked up the sleek internal telephone receiver and dialed the front lobby desk. My evening concierge answered on the very first ring. "Marcus," I said smoothly, my tone entirely professional and completely unbothered by the heavy rain or the heavy drama outside. "There are 3 aggressive, highly agitated vagrants currently trespassing and loitering under the main entrance awning. They are actively disturbing the peace of the building residents. Please dispatch the private building security detail to physically remove them from the premises immediately. If they refuse to vacate the private property line, you have my full authorization to contact the city police department and have them formally arrested for criminal trespassing. I hung up the phone, taking one final, deeply satisfying sip of my vintage wine. Through the thick, soundproof glass of my penthouse windows, I watched the blinking yellow lights of the private security golf carts swarming the front entrance, driving my former family out into the unforgiving darkness of the city streets. The passage of time is the ultimate forensic auditor, bringing every hidden truth into the blinding light of day. Fast forward a few highly productive, completely peaceful months. The federal indictments against DeAndre and my parents were officially unsealed by the Department of Justice, completely dominating the local suburban news cycle and permanently burying whatever tiny fraction of social credibility Patricia had miraculously retained. I put the sprawling suburban estate on the highly competitive real estate market, aggressively staging it to attract wealthy, out-of-state tech executives. It sold in less than 2 weeks in an all-cash transaction netting Phoenix Holdings LLC a massive, unprecedented financial profit. I did not need the excess capital to fund my own lifestyle. Instead, I used a significant portion of those funds to formally launch a dedicated, pro bono financial literacy and legal clinic located right in the heart of the city. We specifically provide aggressive legal counsel, forensic accounting services, and comprehensive credit repair strategies for women who are actively surviving familial financial abuse. The cycle of generational theft ends right here. The dominoes have all finally fallen, leaving me standing alone, completely victorious and entirely free. Now I want to turn the floor over to all of you in the audience. Have you ever had to legally, financially, or emotionally protect yourself from deeply toxic relatives who viewed you solely as a resource to exploit? How did you manage to build your own impenetrable fortress and take your life back from the people who were supposed to protect you? Let me know your unique survival strategies down in the comments below. If this story of absolute financial karma resonated with you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more dramatic forensic takedowns, and always remember to check your credit reports.